My name is John Mark Walker. I've been working in open source communities since 1998, 1999, mostly in the early years doing community building, community engagement for venture-backed startups. And then I was in a startup that was acquired by Red Hat a few years ago. And then ever since then, I've been working in large enterprise organizations, starting with tech companies and then segueing into financial services companies a few years ago. And so the last 10 to 15 years, I've been focused on really figuring out how does open source work in large enterprises and what are the sticking points. One of the reasons I was attracted to large enterprises was I always wondered how come how come you don't see them participate to the same degree in like community spaces as you do, say, like startups or like really forward-thinking tech companies? And so that's something that has been uh, a deep question that I've been asking for a few years now. And along with that, it comes down to, what's especially relevant for this call is, after thinking about how companies participate in open source or don't participate, the analog to that is how do companies use open source principles internally, or as the case may be, not use. And as we look at like the past 20, 25 years, there has been a lot of change in how internal organizations, you know, develop and manage software and develop solutions and handle technology internally. And so we've seen things like, agile and DevOps really take hold and become commonly used terms, and every company seems to have some type of agile transformation. And so the question I've been posing the last couple of years is why haven't we seen the same thing with InnerSource? And which really brings up the question that I have here. Is this InnerSource's moment? Like, are we seeing like a tipping point for open source principles used internally at companies? And so I'm going to walk through the context, some context setting around transformation and how companies have changed the way they collaborate internally. And then I want to talk about how InnerSource can add to those initiatives and potentially complete them, or at least make them more successful than they have been so far. So first, I'm going to do some context setting here. If you look at, say, transformation, and this word gets used a lot, but usually what it means is a company comes to realization that their processes are too brittle, too rigid. They're not getting enough out of their uh, uh, technology efforts, and so they're trying to figure out why that is, and they start looking at things like collaboration frameworks, like say agile, and so they start looking at how they can improve their time to market, how can they enable them to accelerate their efforts and get more out of it and stop being slowed down by undue processes. But what seems to have happened is that even though they've engaged in these transformation efforts, the impact has not been what they expected. And I mentioned on the slide here that engineers are still unhappy, but I would say that like engineers and management and leadership, I would say they're all sort of disappointed is probably a strong word, but they probably all feel that like it's not quite what they thought it would be, not getting out of it quite what they thought they would. And so the question you have to ask then is, why? Um, if they've invested all this time and effort in these transformation initiatives in, say, Agile and DevOps, why is it not giving them the results that they were expecting? And the next question, of course, is what can we do about it? And then the third question is, and pertinent to this discussion, is what is the role that InnerSource can play in helping to complete these transformations and help these organizations realize the potential that they all have. One of the things that I realized um, when I started out in startups, I had this view that most smart people went to startups and those who weren't went to large organizations. I have learned over the years that that is not the case, that there are actually quite a number of bright people that work within our large enterprise organizations. But what I found is that these bright people are often held back by the processes that they are forced to work in. So the question is, how do we free them while at the same time thinking in terms of risk management and the things that are very important to large organizations to maintain some degree of managed control over. So let's look at agile, like how it started and what was the original goal of agile. When agile started, I think it was 2000, 2001. Basically, a bunch of engineers got together over beers and they spent an entire session or a couple days complaining about all the things they're subjected to and all the ways that they were not allowed to be as innovative, to be as productive as they could be if they just could focus on the work. And so what came out of those sessions, or those complaint sessions, was, hey, why don't we true back to a series of core principles, core values that we want everyone to agree to, so that we can set the stage for you know better work, better productivity, and so we can be happy and just focus on the things that we care about. And so they started thinking about, and so they started laying out core values and principles like, hey, let's focus on what customers actually need, right? Let's collaborate, in fact, with customers. Let's not just go in the back room and design something and then hoist it over the wall. Let's actually work in tandem with the customers that we're serving. Let's be reactive. Let's not follow a rigid plan, because rigid plans fall apart, and if you can't change them, then you're not going to be responsive to the needs of customers as you could be. So let's think about ways that we can be more small a agile, and then let's focus on how do we get working software as opposed to quote unquote comprehensive documentation. Let's focus on working code. Let's get that out there, and then finally let's focus on the people, and let's not be restricted so much by moribund rigid processes. How do we focus on getting stuff done over checking boxes on a product requirements document? So it was all about being true to the actual goal and the outcomes that they're trying to deliver, which are all fantastic goals. It's a good thing to keep in mind. But one of the issues is that, and I'll get into this in a bit. Let me go to the next slide. That's where I talk about that. But where it fell short was, you know, sure, they agreed on these core sets of values, but what they didn't do is come up with what's an actual working process that lets us do achieve all the things that we just talked about. And so what ended up happening was, nature abhors a vacuum. So what happens is if you leave a vacuum, something else fills it. And while they did set out, key principles and values that make up the Agile Manifesto, what they didn't do was sort of a soup to nuts end to end, implementation. And so those were blanks and gaps left to be filled in, and they were filled in. And what happens is, basically, agile transformation over the years became a fancy term for re-implementing the old processes that we're trying to get rid of. And this is where I think Conway's law applies, where the thing you're trying to do ends up reflecting the organization that creates it, and it ends up being I guess sort of self-defeating in a way, because it didn't lead to where it should have been. And this sort of leads to the old saw around, no matter what agile implementation you do, someone is going to say that's not really agile, because the implementation was never set up from the beginning in the manifesto. All implementations are different, and everyone claims to have the one true agile implementation. And so, and now we're at the point where every place that I've been, every person I've talked to that's familiar with agile transformations, the term agile waterfall has become sort of an in joke among all of us, where basically waterfall delivery was supposed to end and agile is supposed to be responsive and iterative. And frankly, it just never really worked the way it should have, at least in most places. I'm sure there are some implementations that are good, but the place I've been, it's usually agile waterfall. And then finally, just to sum it up, agile ended up becoming the thing that it was designed to replace, or that they set out to replace, and it became just as bureaucratic and rigid as the things that came before. And I love to say, safe is a type of agile implementation, and as I like to say, safe is a four-letter word. So So what is the issue with Agile? And again, it was designed by idealistic engineers who had very strong opinions about how to design and deliver software, but they kind of made some errors in judgment, I would say. They never really addressed the core motivations or incentives that 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 reign in sort of in a large environment. They didn't think about things like, how does this affect my salary? How does this affect my bonus? Like every organization has different levers for its culture, and so you know, uh, surprise, those don't always line up with building better software. And so I think the people that originally wrote the Agile Manifesto didn't really think about all those other incentives that people work with in a large organization. And I don't think it really occurred to them that, you know, most people are not in fact motivated to design better software. Most people are motivated to do the thing that gets them higher pay. So let's go to, so fast forward a couple of years, you had the Agile movement started in 2000, 2001. And then a couple of years after that, you started to see DevOps. And and DevOps is, the combination of developer and operations or development operations. And we'll get into that in a minute. But you could think of it in a way as sort of Agile plus plus, or going beyond the original, Agile principles and going into what does that look like in practice? How can we actually implement something that adheres to those original values? And the core premise of DevOps was how do we break the silo between developers and operations? And um, the old I guess representation or manifestation of that was, developers would take their requirements and they would build their thing, and then they would hoist over the wall to whoever's in operations who is responsible for supporting that thing. And so you end up with this constant conflict between implementers and developers because people that were charged with actually supporting the thing were always unhappy with the engineers who built it, and vice versa. And so DevOps was premised on the idea that these things should be combined. They should be the same team because you don't want these artificial silos. You want a team working towards the same outcome and delivering something better and more responsive. Um, so that was the idea. And I remember back when DevOps started, it was very philosophical in nature. It was all about empowerment. It was all about bringing people together, getting teams to work more collaboratively. It was a great premise, a great philosophy. But over time, DevOps has really just come to focus on tooling, and all these different, continuous integration, continuous delivery systems and pipelines. And it's kind of lost the original philosophical flair, which was around breaking silos, bringing people together, much like Agile. And now it's just about, okay, I have a CI system, I have a pipeline, and this is how we do DevOps. And so it's kind of cut out the original reason that it was created in the first place. And also, just like Agile, it never really it never really dealt with the motivations for your average tech worker in a large organization. Again, coming back to what is the thing that's going to get me paid or promoted versus, hey, how do we all write better software? So this is a theme I'm hitting on that I'm going to address with InnerSource. But the common theme here is that people with that are ideologically driven come up with like the perfect system, not really considering all the different aspects of working in a large organization that could, get in the way of what they were trying to achieve. So why is this so intractable? And I think, and I liked the picture that shows here about, people not taking out the trash because what is the motivation for doing so? So when you look at the problem of process design and systems and software delivery and management and support, what are people's motivations for doing these jobs in the first place? Why do they do it? How do you incentivize them to do it in a more responsive, way, and in a more productive way? And then like, when you have people working together and you're trying to uh, reduce or remove silos and bring people together in a more collaborative environments, how do we get those exchange of ideas to go, and how do we get them to build traction, and how do we get people to, put their ideas into practice and to test and learn and all that good stuff. And so I think going back to the original values and manifesto and the core principles, the people implementing or responsible for implementing these transformations, just didn't think about the core motivations and how to address that. So I think everyone on the call will understand this slide. This is, now we come to InnerSource. And interestingly, InnerSource, the term, was coined at roughly the same time as Agile, about the same time as the Agile Manifesto, although I think it could have been a little bit earlier. Tim O'Reilly coined it in December 2000 in an article about implementing open source processes internally as a way to, for organizations to be better and more productive. And of course, the origins of the InnerSource Commons came about a few years later with Denise Cooper and Selena Bonewald, and I'm sure there are a host of other people that were involved at that time. I think Russ was involved as well. But basically, it is very simple. Hey, open source seems to provide a great way for people to innovate very quickly, put ideas into practice, test and learn. And in fact, open source communities were, even back then, were quickly becoming the best way to drive innovation and becoming these huge centers of innovation, especially as we know them now. And then can't we capture that same energy and do it internally inside a company? And I think ever since then, the term InnerSource of the last 25 years has kind of waxed and waned. And I think the InnerSource Commons certainly helped to bring about a bit of a messaging discipline around it, which was great. And I think we've seen kind of like a slow increase in interest to the point where I think, now the central question is this really the time where, that companies are going to latch on to InnerSource as a much better way to address their needs. So what is open source? What does it mean to implement open source internally? Let's go back to what open source means and why it's successful. Because if you look at why open source won, why these communities became the way to innovate and become the most innovative groups of people, in technology. There, you can take a couple of key aspects of open source and apply them more generally. For one thing, there are a lot of things that are defined in the license. So there are no downstream limitations on usage. So everyone is free to modify, redistribute, use as they see fit, that sort of thing. And you also get a different kind of community aspects, which is, all participants are equal, mostly. Obviously, there are layers and there are levels. There's a core team, there are contributors, there are users, but by and large, if you come to an open source community, there's a way for you to influence and actually become a core part of the project if you decide to apply your energy there and you demonstrate competence and capabilities that are useful to the broader community. But the very next point there is it's not a free for all. There are rules and stuff, and so but these rules are transparent. Everyone understands to whom they apply and how to work with them. And so it's this transparency, this exchange of ideas, this equality of participants. All of these things drive towards like an innovative framework that we define today as open source. And so if you look at the open source definition, you can see all these things laid out. But generally speaking, it's this equality of participation that drives a lot of the innovation, as well as the diversity of viewpoints that are attracted to open source communities that fundamentally create this bright exchange of ideas, and that's really the engine that powers open source development. So the question is, how do you do this internally? And so when you think about InnerSource and you think about open source principles, it becomes clear that like an InnerSource practice or open source principles can be a core part of your software development lifecycle. You think about how you develop, how you can use inner source and the free exchange of ideas um, to bring about a center of gravity for development in a company. And the center of gravity becomes like this flywheel effect where people are attracted to activity and the activity grows and creates its own kind of like entity in its own right, its own identity. And that's when you get kind of the community traction that we're all looking to drive and benefit from. And this becomes the way that innovation gets supercharged and things start to happen because people want to be part of it. That's ultimately the ideal. Like people do it because it's an attractive thing for them to be a part of. And then the question is, how do you wed that to someone's, you know, uh, professional growth and actually bring together both elements of motivation and incentives. People are motivated because it's fun, but there has to be some benefit, tangible benefit that comes from that. And we can talk about that in a bit more detail. But the bottom line here is that you know I think there's a Gartner term around the center of gravity where it becomes voluntary consolidation or voluntary compliance, where because you have these active communities, people will take on the rules that have been applied or set up because they want to be part of something. And this is like you want the pull. You don't want to tell people what to do. You want the pull, and people come to you and do the right thing. This is where the active exchange ideas and the free exchange ideas becomes like the sort of siren call to your developers. So one of the things I've noticed is that even though you can say that open source communities are the most innovative in the world and that this is a good model to apply internally in a company, the fact of the matter is InnerSource is kind of a scary um, uh, prospect for your typical large organization. And it's scary for lots of reasons. But mostly it's that the core principles of open source are kind of orthogonal to how companies work internally. If you want to have the free exchange of ideas and software, and you want people to be able to take something and use it for their own purposes, that works against a company culture that wants to consolidate, and they usually want to consolidate in a top-down mechanism where once you define what you can and can't use, there's no you know there's not as much opportunity to kind of test and learn a lot of different things and settle on the best one. There's usually like a mandate of what you can and can't use from the beginning. Similarly, if you look at an open source principle around all participants being equal, I mean, that's obviously not the case in a large organization because in a lot of these organizations, you don't want all parties to have equal say. You want to basically bias towards a person or a certain team, and that works against the philosophy of ideas competing for superiority. In many cases, the scales are weighted very heavily toward the specific idea or solution, and a lot of times you're expected to go along with it. Um, Another core principle of open source being transparent and frictionless. A lot of times, decision making in organizations is not transparent. Some organizations do better at this than others, but a lot of organizations they don't really have a transparent decision making process. It's not open to input from all parties. They make a decision, and you're expected to comply. And then when you look at like governing rules for open source projects, a lot of times these governing rules are dependent upon basically who's contributing, who demonstrates the most competence, and these can cut across a number of geographies and other boundaries. Whereas in a large organization, in a software project, it's defined by the team members, and those team members roll up into a specific organization, and that organization is tasked with building a certain thing. And so getting other organizations to be considered like a key driver of that project can be a little bit maybe scary is too strong a word, but it's certainly not encouraged the same way it would be in an open source project. And so um, these sort of cultural and organizational constraints prevent InnerSource from being prevents open source implementations from being done the same way that it would be externally. And you always have to think about inner source working within these constraints, and is it possible to achieve what you want to given the constraints you have to work with? But at the same time, you can't beat the fact you can't beat the innovation that comes from an open source process and from open source principles. When you think about how it could benefit organizations, and if you think about no limitations on usage, well, that could inspire teams to compete. That can inspire teams to come up with the best solutions, and then to compare the solutions to other teams. It becomes, and then that's how you get the sort of collaboration that can be so rewarding for everyone. If all participants are equal, then you can have an environment where all contributions are valued, no matter what the source of those are. When you have transparent and frictionless process, you can actually create a free exchange of ideas. You can have a healthy, competitive, but also cooperative and collaborative ecosystem. And if there were sort of governing rules that cut across boundaries, you can actually facilitate a culture of accountability where multiple parties can provide input and be accountable for producing the results that everyone wants to drive towards. It all comes down to how do you bring these incentives and motivation into the core company culture, and that's where it becomes a challenge. But it is possible. I'm convinced, and so I think if companies really want to go beyond where they've been with the transformation challenges, this is a way to do it. I think this points in the right direction. You can see some writings on the subject, especially from someone like Jim Whitehurst, who wrote about the open organization and talked about how Red Hat facilitates this kind of culture. And I think that's certainly something that teams can look towards as a North Star to drive in. So what does it add to transformation? If you think about transformation as a three-legged stool with agile, DevOps, and InnerSource, what is the role for InnerSource? The first thing is, agile and DevOps should not be scrapped. There are obvious gains to be made there. There are obvious advances that have been made thanks to both of those transformational implementations. But there's something to be said for adding an InnerSource component here. And so it adds momentum to the whole concept of silo busting, because it actually writes in its rules how to cut across silos in really any kind of boundary. It also provides a way for if you have talented engineers who feel stymied or unable to contribute in the way that they know how, this provides an avenue for them to do that and to demonstrate that competence and in ways that maybe are not available to them. This is where you can kind of weave in the incentive and motivation. But also, like I mentioned before, it facilitates a culture of accountability because of the way InnerSource cuts across boundaries and silos. You're able to demonstrate where these contributions are coming from and who's been the most helpful and productive in ways that you can't do if you don't have an InnerSource process. And then finally, like I said before, it accelerates the ecosystem and collaboration that you would get otherwise. It basically takes previous transformation efforts and accelerates and puts it in like a faster plane. So let's compare like how this actually works in practice, because if you look at the classic kind of product development lifecycle, and you think about your classic agile model, and you think about how customers and stakeholders are still a bit distant from the design and development process, where you have like, sure, they're involved, but it's usually in sort of like a middle layer where developers, are building, and then they show their work to customers and stakeholders, get input, take it back, take feedback, and then roll it into their product design process. I just want to point out that like there's more than one way to do all of this. I'm just presenting two examples for comparison purposes, and neither of these apply in all cases. I'm just saying that there's an alternative to no matter what way you do it. So that's the classic agile use case. But when you think about an InnerSource use case, in those cases, that middle circle is taken out entirely, because in this case, customers, stakeholders, engineers, product owners, they're all kind of like in the same room, designing as you go and building the product together because they're providing input either because they are owning some parts of the documentation, or they're responsible for an implementation, or they're responsible for actually doing the code themselves or getting requirements. The point is that they're all considered, their input is all valued, and they're all considered on an equal basis as they work towards the common goal of delivering this project. Like I said, there's more than one way to do it. These are just two examples, and what you do in a given at a given moment depends on which what kind of stakeholders you're working with and how likely they are to be, highly involved in a given project. And then finally, inner source and collaboration in general, these are always a work in process. You're never done. It's something that requires kind of constant minding, or you could say gardening. Um, like all good things, it doesn't grow in trees. You have to facilitate it. You have to monitor it. You have to make sure everyone is kind of moving in the right direction. It just requires regular reinforcement of norms. You don't want, it's very easy, even in an inner source environment, it'd be easy for someone to take control of the project and just kind of like not consider input from other parties. That's certainly a thing that can happen. And so being there to reinforce the norms of collaboration is something that you have to do regardless of what process you're doing, but certainly in inner source, it's no exception. You still have to make sure that folks understand what the expectations are and how do we continue on the right path. And this is my favorite graphic of all time, where uh, someone's offering help with wheels and two people trying to carry a very heavy box with square wheels are saying no thanks, we are too busy. This is the classic, I've got control of my project and I'm going to continue going through it no matter what, and I don't need your help. So this is something that happens a lot, at least that I've seen. And so it's always a good way to, there's always it's always good to facilitate the collaboration when it yields the results that you want. And so let's talk about how inner source can work inside a large organization, because one of the things that happens is because things can be heavily siloed and because some teams just don't talk to each other, it's important to kind of lay the groundwork and figure out what are the community forums that you can build that will drive the participation that you're looking for. It's not just going to happen organically. You have to set the stage for it, and you have to like provide a safe place for these conversations to happen, in the open, to set the stage for successful inner source implementation. Let me talk about what you mean. In Agile, you have a concept of communities of practice, for example, where you'll have groups of people with like, either they're like-minded in philosophy or they're working on similar things. And so you have a community practice around, there's a lot of companies probably have a community practice for, continuous integration or pipelines. A lot of companies will have communities of practice for, Java development or something like that. And so the question is, how do you use a similar structure for to drive the sort of inner source adoption you're looking for? Another common term is special or shared interest group, or SIGs. It's the same thing. It's all about bringing together like-minded people in sort of a birds of a feather environment. And so it's essential to doing this because it helps you cut through some of the clutter, because a lot of the communication mechanisms and change management mechanisms are fairly staid and rigid and difficult to work through. Whereas if you can just bring people together to talk, you can often get to, drive towards some type of, action, sooner. And SIGs or COPs, they provide they start to form the basis for what will be considered a governing framework for inner source projects. And I'll get some more detail on that later. But it's a great example of how inner source can build on the infrastructure that comes out of an agile transformation. and let's show how this can actually work in practice. Because if you start with like, let's say we start with like a problem area that has a lot of stakeholders, like let's say, Java development, right? And you say, okay, well, let's create a community practice around for our Java developers. Let's see how we can like come together, and reach, work towards a common purpose. And so what ends up happening is when you cut across these silos and you bring together people from multiple teams, organizations, it ends up accelerating these feedback loops, and you start getting um, input from people that you wouldn't have had otherwise. And you start to get people exchanging ideas. And then from there, you have your resident experts who are part of this, uh, who become helpful in supporting other developers that are maybe newer, or it becomes like a mentorship platform, it becomes a support platform that people can come to get the problem solved. And from there, it can continue to grow organically until you get to a group of people that have a free exchange of ideas. And then from there, that free exchange of ideas starts to seed inner source projects that these people want to work on. They wouldn't have found each other without the community practice or SIG, but then they did find each other. They found it useful. They stuck around, and then that community starts to take on its identity and starts to mature, and then you start getting like real collaborative work that comes out of it. And this is where you can spawn inner source efforts from existing infrastructure that comes from your agile work and ends up being like this extension of, say, an agile transformation. So here's some things that we've learned. I mean, first of all, no methodology is perfect, right? So whether you've done agile, DevOps, or inner source, again, it requires constant maintenance, management, reinforcements. None of these things are perfect. You have to figure out ways to get these processes to work together to reach the desired result. Um, it's very important that the people participating in these things be people that are willing to get their hands dirty. Don't, and that doesn't mean necessarily code. It just means someone that wants to be actively involved in delivery in whatever way, whether it's process management, process refinement, or documentation, or change management slash marketing. Marketing is a word that we don't use much in internal organizations, but it's really what it is. But regardless, it's important that the people involved be willing to contribute in whatever way they can. Um, and then let's make sure that we've got, because of our community practice, we have ways of getting stakeholder alignment in ways that we wouldn't have otherwise. But again, it's something that needs to be constantly maintained, because things can get out of alignment very quickly. But it's important that everyone involved believe in the project, believe in the inner source philosophy itself, believe that this is a way that they can accomplish more things faster than they could before. And then finally, a caveat to all this is that entrenched processes are extremely difficult to change. And as others have mentioned, uh, culture change in general is very difficult. It's not something you can do overnight. Change, it has to be incremental. It's never going to be as comprehensive as you would like it to be, but you can make significant advancements just through establishing core principles and believing in the outcome and getting people to participate. And if you once you really get at the core motivations and incentives for people to adopt and be part of this, you're setting the stage for going beyond what you're able to do before. So all in all, I think now is probably a great time for companies or other large organizations to consider InnerSource, because like I said before, there is no comparison to the innovation that comes from open source communities. And I think large organizations can certainly benefit from applying those principles internally and figuring out how to layer it into what they've already established so far. So that's all I had. Uh, I hope that was useful, folks, and looking forward to questions.